Technically, in the world, Great Britain is still the centre of motor racing, and therefore it should have a capital. The capital of racing is probably a small Midlands town in England called Bicester. It's to Bicester that I went to see the Leighton House March factory and to be fitted for their car. I met up with Ian Phillips, the team manager, and Adrian Newey, the designer of the car. Now, in 1989, the March Judd has not been as competitive as people would have liked it to be. But in 1988, that March 881 was really a competitive motor car. I was able to take the car after its initial fitting to Silverstone. And Silverstone, for the British Grand Prix in 1988, had been a big racetrack for Ivan Capelli, who was driving the car in that Grand Prix. The car was very strange. The era of the designer seems to have appeared, because racing drivers themselves, it would seem, have not a lot of say with regards to the cockpit comforts or refinements. My biggest criticism of the March was the incredible lack of space. For the driver, there was no space, because Adrian Newey, the designer, said it had to be that way, because aerodynamically, the car had to be this narrow and this shape. I had to point out to him that it was almost impossible, even for me, and I'm a man of average height, I call it average height, relatively small, to fit into his cockpit. I seemed to get cramp on my foot, and I do remember that Capelli suffered very badly in 1988 by leg cramps and foot cramps. There was no footrest to speak of for the left foot. There was simply nowhere to put your foot other than on the clutch pedal. And if a racing driver touches a racing clutch at high speed, it only takes a few short laps to burn the clutch out. So really the impracticability of having such a narrow footwell, in my mind, was a folly.
As soon as we start the engine up, you can turn the pump on.
The team, however, was very efficient, was extremely good to work with. 60 people worked in the Leighton House March team at that time, against, for example, the 160 that worked for McLaren. Silverstone is almost billiard table smooth, hardly any bumps at all, but the pit lane is bumpy, and the suspension of the March was so firm, so tight, that when you left the pit lane and went over some bumps on the track, your feet bounced off the pedals and bounced off the floor well in such a way that you could hardly control the car. That impressed me in a negative fashion. The car just seemed to be too hard. And again, aerodynamics were making that car run very close to the ground to get maximum performance out of it. I found it also very difficult to drive this car at great speed at Silverstone. It's such a fast corner with so many high-speed corners that, frankly, when you're new to a car, and for me, coming back to motor racing, I just never felt that I wanted to take too much out of the car or too much out of me. The penalty for error at Silverstone is too great, because hardly any of the corners are slow. So therefore my experience there was to be indoctrinated with the new generation of Grand Prix car. And certainly this was, even amongst the others, perhaps the firmest, perhaps the roughest to drive with regards to harshness. And certainly it would appear to be the smallest. It was fast at that time, but it wasn't comfortable. And I don't really think their two drivers, Gugelmin, who is very fast, and Capelli, also very fast, could have taken the maximum out of that car, or driven the car to the ultimate limit of their abilities, simply because it was too uncomfortable and too cramped. Nevertheless, they gave me every cooperation. The Judd engine performed well. It was a flexible engine. It didn't seem to have an excess of power, but it certainly didn't give me any trouble on pick-up or on lift-off. Ran into some mechanical problems with it. Electrical, it turned out to be, and I suppose that I was doing some good service to them to have their electrical problems weeded out before the next Grand Prix, which they were just about to go over to. So driving the March, to say the least, was uncomfortable, but nevertheless impressive.